Welcome to the Startup Grind.
All the value creation, all the brilliant idea, all the innovation, all the asset creation, they would lose their value if this planet, the planet would exist, but if it becomes unfeasible for us to survive on this planet. COVID, as they say, was just an alarm. But now, with the perpetual pandemic and this neo-COVID fear coming, I don't think it's any longer an alarm. It's right there on our head. We have encroached too much into the nature. And it's time that we fix our steps right here, right now.
It's Mike.
Hi,
yeah,
Mike.
I'm a Japanese American. I've lived in Japan now 35 years, originally from California. I studied environmental science, nutritional science back in college almost 40 years ago. And now I work inside of a rural government cultural center. And basically the community still uncovers archaeological discovery of artifacts from as far back as about 6,000 years ago, depending on how deep they dig. And being in this part of Kyushu, it's definitely where a lot of culture that arrived via the Korean Peninsula from China, Buddhism from India, et cetera, passed through Kyushu before being taken up in Honshu and Kyoto, and inclusive things like tea, the kanji character set, et cetera. What I've been working on is develop means by which part of it is that history is retained in a culturally relevant way, but also for revitalization or changing the landscape, including the riverbeds and the mountain sides, and for biodiversity, et cetera. And it goes along with what I've been doing basically for the past 35 years in rural organizations and ICT usage and international relations. So I lived in Tokyo, based in Tokyo for 33 years. Now I've spent just about exactly a year so far in rural Kyushu, and I met Trista. We met sometime probably about 4 or 5 years ago when you were relatively recent to Japan. Mm-hmm. And I remember you didn't know that you were into sustainability. I remembered the French background, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excited to be here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Mike. Mike, we would love to connect with you and know more about the work you're doing, because it does sound interesting. And it's all about sustainability is the core ethics is collaboration. We have to understand that we are part of a much bigger organism, and harmony is the key. So collaboration is what leads to harmony, and let's all collaborate. But we'll have last 15 minutes where we'll open the floor, and we'll love to know more about you. Hi, Trista. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Would you like to take a minute to introduce yourself on this?
Hi, everyone. It's good to see everyone. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting and engaging discussion. My name is Trista. I co-founded an organization and run an organization called Read the Air. And Read the Air works with organizations of all sizes to help them transition to a more sustainable model. Because our idea and our thinking is that we've had a lot of action, obviously, from NGOs for a very, very long time on the topic of some of the things that Nayana mentioned. We've had some action by government, but we definitely need more action from businesses, and that means businesses of all sizes, not just the big guys, not just certain industries, but also startups. Startups are a very, very important part of that puzzle as well. I've been in Japan for 6 years now, it'll be 7 years this summer. Prior to that, I was living in France for many years, about 13 years, prior to that London, and then prior to that the United States, where I'm from. I actually have 2 nationalities, I'm American and French. So I tend to bring a very global perspective to a lot of discussions, just because I've lived kind of in many different places in my life and have worked with many different types of people on many different continents. So I think that one of the stories, important parts of the sustainability story, is the fact that, you say we're all in it together. We really are. If we fix things in Japan or the United States or in Europe, it means nothing if we don't fix things in India and Chile and South Africa and many, many other countries as well. So that's kind of me, who I am.
Trista, can you tell us more about Read the Air?
Sure. So as I mentioned, it kind of started, it's more of a initiative than a company per se, because what we wanted to do is, I have a co-founder, Donald Eubank, and we wanted to build it, like you said, in a collaborative way, right? Because from our perspective, if you look at the sustainability challenge, it's a very complex challenge, actually, right? So it requires not just business knowledge, it requires scientific knowledge, it requires knowledge about people and about how we change behavior and all of these different things. And so we felt, the modern organization that we have isn't really one company, it's many different people collectively working together to do something. So that's kind of how we structured it. It grew out of a book we wrote called Leading Sustainably, The Path to Sustainable Business and How the SDGs Changed Everything, which actually came out, we finished it in 2019. We had to rewrite parts of it when COVID happened, actually, because it changed the story pretty profoundly. And then it came out right in the middle of all of the world locking down, which was kind of really a bit strange and surreal in itself. But like you said earlier, COVID has really kind of shown the spotlight on a lot of the issues that many people who've been passionate about these things have been for a very long time. And so myself, I kind of always had this real issue around kind of how companies operated, and the fact that, we were quite singularly focused on things like profit. People have been working around this idea for a very long time of, coming up with ways to kind of value what companies contribute or what they take away or mess up, frankly, and to really kind of use that as a value of an organization. And this was, very radical thinking, 30 years ago. Now, however, it's starting to come to be more accepted, right? We don't really have good ways of doing that yet in terms of from a quantitative perspective, but we certainly are getting there in terms of a qualitative perspective. So, what we aim to do also with Read the Air is also to kind of bring more of this stakeholder approach to thinking about the world and thinking about business challenges and an organization's place in that challenge. So we've worked with kind of large companies, very large organizations, global organizations. We've worked with service companies. I also, in the capacity, advise a venture capital fund here about integration of ESG into how they operate, and also how they work with their startups to do the same. Because the idea here is that, if we don't start when companies are young, it's very difficult to change them when they've been around for, 100, 200 years sometimes. I mean, changing a company like Mitsubishi, for example, it's been around for 600 years. Very difficult challenge. A lot of Japanese companies in particular have been around for a very long time. So it's really important, I think, for us to, think about how we're going to do that, and to kind of start with organizations when we're young.
There are 3 main things from this that I would like to discuss with you. One is, of course, your book, because I feel this book could be instrumental in helping young businesses formulate their strategies in how to be, sensitive to the ESG specifications. Because I guess a lot of entrepreneurs today, I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of them, they feel that innovation is the key, being siloized with the technology. That's what I said. Sometimes you're so siloized with the idea that we have failed to see that there's a much bigger aspect, and that is the climate crisis. the sustainability crisis, the wealth inequity crisis. Sometimes when I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, they say, it doesn't make sense. I'm adding value in people's life. What am I to do with climate change? What am I to do with wealth inequity? I'm creating value and I should be, helped for that. What would you say to such entrepreneurs?
I mean, I think that, one of the things that organizations need to do, or companies, and I think individuals need to do is maybe not think of things as problems or costs or difficult to them, and maybe see the opportunity in it. So one of the things that we're starting to see, and part of the reason that I think companies of all sizes are starting to pay attention, is because there's actually a lot of very good business models in tackling big problems. Certainly climate tech, for example, has increased dramatically in terms of investment in the last couple of years. And I should say that, many years ago, venture capital funds did not want to touch anything that had any tinge of government regulation because it was difficult, right? Dealing with, young companies dealing with government things, as well as, regulations and laws and these types of things, as well as thinking about product market fit or thinking about growth or market expansion, But actually now what they're finding is that there's a lot of great opportunity in dealing with these big problems. And also, I would argue that, when I was in France, I worked in the startup ecosystem there well over 10 years ago. And those were the early days. And I remember probably dating myself a lot, but I remember the dot-com boom and bust. And, a lot of the innovation that was kind of the easy stuff kind of got done, right? Now we have the really hard stuff, and I think, things that people are doing things with AI, and people doing things with, like, for example, even with the vaccines that we've seen, that type of science, it's not easy stuff. And it took a long time actually to develop that type of technology that could be used in an actual application. But we see, young entrepreneurs working on so many challenging, tough problems. So instead of looking at it as, I'm a small company, this is difficult for me, I would look at it more as, well, is there an opportunity here to provide services and innovation that can address social challenges and problems, and environmental as well, of course.
So I am an entrepreneur and I developed some interesting innovative solution. But my intelligence or my knowledge is limited to that innovation.
Yes.
I want to be sensitive to climate. I want to be sensitive to the inequity. I want to be sensitive on how I can help my environment. That's the whole aspect. So how do we bring in that ESG intelligence in? How can people like Read the Air and Empower help such entrepreneurs?
Certainly I do a lot of, because entrepreneurs, don't necessarily have loads of money or revenue and such. So I actually, coach startups, I advise startups, I try to help them as I can with my network and my contacts. So, that's kind of how I aim to help them. Another thing that actually I encourage them to do is to work within communities of similar minded entrepreneurs. So increasingly, there's a lot of very interesting networks to help small companies to kind of tackle these challenges. So for example, one of the ones that's a very good one, it's based out of Europe, but it's expanding globally. It's called Leaders for Climate Action. And they provide things like guides, they provide free carbon calculation tools, they provide all types of things. And, small companies don't really need overly engineered technology to take action on these things. There's a lot of things that are free and widely available for them to utilize. So I certainly, when I talk with people, I suggest these types of networks. Certainly on climate, there's lots of things there. There's also lots of things there on things like diversity. Diversity, equity, inclusion is another huge topic for companies of all sizes, and particularly younger companies. And there's one really key reason, which is finding talent. It's increasingly difficult to find people to do work, right? And there's actually demographic reasons for that. So a place like Japan, for example, where the younger generation's a bit smaller, right? Companies are having to turn towards new types of people that they wouldn't have before, even in different geographies. So one of the things that, COVID has done is it's moved a lot of us onto technological platforms to communicate and to work together. And yes, we will still go into offices, but also now you can work with people in different regions of the world. There's nothing really stopping you from doing that anymore. So on the diversity, equity, inclusion front, it's really important to think more broadly about talent. And as a company, that is the one of the things that actually makes it or breaks most companies. We think it's business model, we think it's marketing and all these wonderful things, but actually it's the people who are within the organization and your ability to find talent. And a lot of investors actually focus a lot of time on helping startups with that type of thing. And then I would also say one other area that's really important for startups as well, especially those working with tech, are any types of things around data and privacy, which I'm sure a lot of people on this call are really challenging or find challenging or dealing with. And there's lots of really good tools out there now for that. So for example, there's one good one called ECOLOGY, and they have a whole set of questions and tools that you ask. You just Google and find it, ECOLOGY. There's another one called Tech Risk Zones, and they say all the things that can be problematic for startups if they don't kind of think about them early on. So if we look at large tech success stories like Facebook and Google and all these organizations, they're having to deal with a lot of those problems now. They didn't deal with them so much 10, 15 years ago. And because of that, they're dealing with them now. So I think it's something that's really helpful to think about from the start. But there are resources out there, and just have to kind of make sure, do a little bit of digging to find them. But it's pretty easy to locate, put your hands on them.
Another aspect, just I would like to ask is, what I see is with venture capitalists is most of the time it's very myopic. It's like, I put some money in, and 10 years later, I want some 30% profit or this or that. There's no regulation there that what are you investing in? What shall be the repercussions of it? What do you think can be done in such a space? Because venture capitalism is like it's the petrol pump of the car. Or
yes.
How to handle this aspect?
So this is a really difficult question, to be honest, because it is a space that's very, how do I say, it's not secretive per se, but it's purposely run by people who really don't want to have, be under kind of a regulatory framework. So that's really important to say, right? So when you look at a lot of companies and you look at even Silicon Valley, what their origins are, the origins are really kind of countercultural in some ways. You don't want to be, these maybe people who don't want to work in banks, right? And that have been heavily regulated and focused, because they've created so many issues, and then they're heavily regulated again, and then they fix the issues. So I think there's a couple of things that are needed. First of all, they do need to move more into a regulatory situation, most likely, and that's actually starting to happen. So for example, in Europe, they have some regulation that's coming on that's really encouraging funds, people who are promoting sustainable products. So, now what's happening in finance, which is really interesting, is that people feel, like I said before, like there's business in it. So they're basically an opportunity. So they're marketing a lot of stuff as sustainable that may not be. And so what's happening is the EU is saying, well, if you're going to do that, you need to show us that you're doing that, right? And improve it, right? Yeah. So that's now a framework that's being looked at elsewhere. So in Singapore and Japan, United States, they are not necessarily doing it yet, but they are looking at it. Another thing, it's always also it's a bit of a stick, are the LPs. So the people who invest in venture capital funds. Now, these entities are different in different places, but when they're corporations, actually the corporations and LPs are now pushing them to be more, to focus on these issues because it's risky for them, right? They're, if they're, I don't know, a large multinational organization and they've made all kinds of commitments around diversity and around climate, and they're putting their money in vehicles or in companies that don't do the same, that's a real risk for them. So that's the thing. And I think also the last thing is we're starting to see a generational shift. That's not important. That's a really important thing to kind of remember, is that, once we have wealth transfer, a lot of the people coming into venture capital are also coming in with a different mindset. So yes, in venture capital, there's a long way to go. But, and the last thing I would say is actually, if they don't focus on it, it could be kind of risky for them to raise capital, for example, from LPs, to also to attract the best startups to invest in. There's a lot of startups now who actually like it when the venture funds focus on this because they have those same values. So I think we'll see change coming in the coming years, but it's not going to be quick. And I'd say outright that it's a difficult space. You're seeing more progressiveness and advancement on this from the startups themselves than you are sometimes their funders, which is kind of a strange situation to be in, but we'll see. I think the next few years will be pretty interesting on that front.
Just on this, continuing on the same aspect of asymmetry. So we have seen a general trend of sensitivity when it comes to startups in developed countries. In Japan, in States, we have a lot of entrepreneurs coming and talking about sustainability and environment crisis. And I'm not saying that developing world is not contributing its fair share, but there comes an argument that when there is extreme poverty or inequity, how do you develop an entrepreneurship encouragement ecosystem that is also sensitive to the SDGs or the ESG guidelines? Because definitely there is a cost factor right now involved till we actually bring in the carbon tax, or we start bringing the cost of environment in the business model. Till that time, it is definitely a little expensive. So what are your thoughts about that? How can that aspect be handled?
I think that's a very difficult question, to be honest, to answer. In some ways, it's really difficult. I think, having been somebody who grew up my life in developed countries, right, who did all kinds of terrible exploitative things to many parts of the world, including our own countries, to go to people in emerging markets and saying, well, guess what? Now the rules have changed. You can't do that anymore. You have to do something a little different. But I think that, unfortunately, that's the reality that a lot of these entrepreneurs are going to be facing. But, there is good news. I think on the developed country side, in terms of what we can do and what we should be doing, is there were a lot of pledges made at COP26 about providing this funding to ease the burden of, innovators and creators and the people in these countries. So to kind of give them the space, the financial and economic space to be able to innovate. And we need to be respecting those pledges. That's the first thing. So we have a responsibility, all the banks and financial institutions and governments who said, we're going to be giving, hundreds of billions or trillions or whatever they committed to, 3 trillion, I think was the number or something. We're going to give that money. We need to make sure that they do it. And that's not just, people like me, that's also civil society. NGOs have a real role to play to make sure that they provide that funding. The entrepreneurs in that market, one of the things actually you do see a lot of the kind of social problem, social challenge, social opportunity innovation actually comes from emerging markets. If you think like microfinance, mobile first, all of that all came from the southern, we call the southern half of our world, right? It didn't really come initially from northern parts of the world, and people have taken those models and are doing us. So, for example, microfinance is now an interesting innovation that's extended to the United States, because the United States obviously has very big income disparity, and people are looking at those models for how do we get money to people for education, for example, because it's so expensive. So I think that actually there's a lot of social innovation going on in those parts of the world, right? We maybe they don't get the publicity and the spotlight that they should get. But a lot of those ideas came from there first. I actually have a friend that was he was traveling in Kenya, and he was kind of telling me about his trip, and I was shocked and delighted to learn. He said, actually, there's a lot of increasing number of villages now that are actually running and powered by solar energy, because for them, they're so far anyway from the kind of the grid that they had to find a way on their own to basically, get electricity. And he said it's so much better now than it was 5 years ago when he was there last time. So actually, sometimes conditions can create opportunity in ways that you don't suspect. So actually, if you're in Nairobi, it's probably worse to get access to energy regularly or electricity regularly than it may be in some more remote areas. And that's kind of an interesting situation, but there may be opportunities like that, to kind of innovate around those challenges.
And you see opportunity when you see that there is a cost. It could be cost in terms of wellness, happiness, or in terms of wealth or lack of opportunity, or there could be general societal pain points, this calamity that we are soon heading towards. There are technologies to solve the problem, but how do you make people, agree to solve the problem? A lot of people just deny that there is a thing called climate crisis, that fossil fuels cause all sort of pollution, or that there are third world countries where people are not being adequately fed.
Unfortunately, there's always a segment of the population that just is not going to believe and it's going to continue to live how they want to live. I will say that on terms of acknowledgement that there's a climate emergency has grown pretty significantly in the last several years. So that's good, right? I'd say you're hard pressed to find people. They exist. I'm not saying they don't exist.
Yeah.
There are people who would say it's completely a hoax. There's still a portion, but that portion has gotten smaller over time. Okay.
Yeah.
The problem is that people just don't want to do things differently. They don't want anything that might be seeming to be an inconvenience to them.
Yeah.
So what people are trying to do, and this may not necessarily be the best answer, but they're trying to come up with ways, well, how can I replicate a similar experience for them so their lifestyle doesn't feel dramatically impacted, right? And get them to shift. So for example, all of the meat replacement stuff that you probably see, that stuff isn't really for people who are strict vegetarians.
Yeah.
That's for people who normally eat meat, who want a meat eating experience. So can we get people to at least maybe just eat it a little less? And if everybody ate it a little less, then maybe we could solve the problem. I think, changing behavior is a little of that. It's a little of how can we preserve a little bit of what people have? I think it's also storytelling. So I think the media is getting better at telling stories about this too, whether it be movies like, there was that movie Don't Look Up, which is about the asteroid, but it's really about the climate crisis. If it's, there was one great series done in the New York Times. There was a building, I think we talked about the other day, collapse in Miami. And the reason that building collapsed was because the garage kept flooding over time. So every time there was a bad hurricane or storm, the waters would kind of come in and they would flood the garage and then they would recede. And this happened so much, and it was such an old building that over time structurally it decreased. And apparently the New York Times said that there's literally dozens of buildings in the exact same condition on that coastline. And that's shocking, right? Like that's, I think that's the thing is, in your house, in your town, in your village, in wherever, this is what is absolutely going to happen to you and can happen to you. And so, like Mike from Kyushu, and they've had a lot of issues. I know several years in the kind of southwest part of Japan with landslides, with floods, and all types of things. But I think we also need to tell better stories more regularly, especially amongst younger people, children, about what's likely to happen, right? And not terrify people, but we need to talk about what consequences are of inaction.
I would like to know more about your book.
So it was written actually for people who don't really know a lot about sustainability, right? So the idea was that there's a lot of people who are experts, and we didn't really want to write it for sustainability experts. We wanted to write it for people who are going to start doing something, taking some action, who care a little bit, or who are dealing with this at their job, but they're not really sure what to do. But I think it's very good for, first of all, the background of how we got here. So the whole first part kind of tells a story of, well, why are people so concerned about this now? How did we get to the point? Like we talked about earlier, people didn't used to think that climate change affected the earth at all, right? And that it was man-made. People didn't think that. People didn't believe that, just like people didn't think that, cigarettes were bad for you and that were addictive, right? At one point in time. And so we kind of tell this story about how we kind of got to this point. We give a lot of tools around things like frameworks and things. People probably know about, we have the SDGs, obviously, but, we have B Corps, we have GRI, which does kind of ESG type of criteria that we use to kind of think about sustainability. We provide those for people so they can kind of think about that. We also talk a lot about finance and sustainable finance. frameworks for how companies can take action, and also just some interesting things about industries and some of the great things that they're doing around. We talk about fashion and insurance and other things. And then the last thing I would say is we have these things in the book called mission-driven vignettes, and they're little stories of companies that are, in our opinion, fully sustainable companies. And most of these companies are not big companies. Most of these companies are small companies. So, when I talk to startups and SMEs and I hear them say, well, it's tough for us because it's costly, there are actually a lot of startups and SMEs who are doing incredible work around sustainable products and solutions, and more every day. So it's absolutely doable. And we wanted to put those stories in the book so people could get inspiration and they could know that they can do it too.
Just a closing message for our viewers today.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing I would say is, don't give up hope. And we always say, start with something, do something. There's a lot of people thinking about doing things. It's better to just, take an action, try. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But it's better to kind of at least take an action, take a first step, and try to, to change things as you can, right? And no action is too small. But, of course, have a certain level of ambition. But just, stay positive and try to make a difference as you can. I think particularly entrepreneurs can certainly do a lot in that vein. And for anyone who's interested in kind of chatting at any time or anything, please do feel free to reach out to me. I'm always on LinkedIn. I do courses sometimes when people ask me to come speak. So I have come and spoken, for example, at universities. And that I'm happy to do. I'm doing actually one end of March with my co-founder. And I don't, charge things for that or anything, but, for students, certainly. I also take interns sometimes, people who are interested in learning about this as well, because I think that's important to do. So I have no problems with doing that. And I also mentor young people too, who are interested in this, just because, I think it's also important to give people access.
With this, we would have to wrap the event. I would like to say thank you to all of you individually.
Startup Grind.